Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today we are at lecture 6 and we are going to talk about understanding vernacular and towards anthropology. Till now we did discuss about how the vernacular could be classified, and we talked about the primitive, we talked about the pre-industrial vernacular, we talked about the high or modern vernacular, and we also talked about vernacular architecture. It's not just a product, but it is also a process, how it is designed and built. But then when we talk about the methods of what kind of methods are more appropriate for understanding vernacular architecture. In fact, this is a very complex subject, and it is not very easy to just define only these methods will do for this, these methods will do for this. And they vary by context, and they vary by the situation. They also vary by time, and they also vary by perception, from whose perspective you are trying to understand. Now, I would start with a simple question. Being an architect, how to study a building and a place? In fact, as an architect, when we talk about a building, we obviously look from a kind of perspective of how it was built, what are the spaces, and how it has evolved. So maybe a kind of chronological thinking. In fact, if you look at the Thai house, for instance, because the Thai houses are mostly referred from the 13th century, and where the Lana kingdom, the traditional Lana house, which have a kind of conical thing, and then they call it as a kind of chen, which is about terrace. So this is a kind of traditional Lana house, and then how the Thai house have gradually evolved into this, and this is how what you can see here is the Siamese or the Thai house, which is evolved from the Lana house. And one of the interesting aspect of how one can study a building is, in fact, there is also certain religious practices which one can look at understanding the social practices or the religious practices, how one perform in the dwelling, and how and as a result what kind of spaces are produced and how they consume these places. In fact, they follow kind of animism, and here they call a kind of Buddhism. So there are different practices, and even that has a reflection in their form, in their the way it gives certain meanings and their association. Now, Phumparoj, he talks about the recalibrating the new Thai vernacular architecture. In fact, what he does is the post 13th centuries, I would say maybe about a little correction in this, and you can see the transformation of a traditional Thai house. He actually documents the way the Thai house is gradually changing by its form, by its usage. So now initially, if you see the kind of raised plinths on the timber post, they call it the Ryun Thai, which could be also easily dismantled and transportable, because sometimes it could be taken to its original location or to be taken to the uplands in the case of floods or any other kind of any needed time. So here the kind of functions they have, the kind of spaces which they have is a small this open space which is a part of many cultural activities and to their daily life livelihood activities. But now, following I would say from 1960s onwards, I'm not saying exactly from 19, more or less around the modernistic movements, where the usage of car comes, and you can see that these are all made at different levels. But what is happening is there are 6 major transformations which have taken this place. One is the central terrace. This terrace is now shifted like this, and the multi-level to a flat floor. Now it's all one straight. Changes of an area under a raised dwelling. So in fact, this whole part now they are using for a kind of car parkings and things like that. And then disappearance of veranda and erection of a porch at the front. So in fact, they are putting some kind of the traditional verandas. They are gone now, and the orientations have slightly changed onto this side, and a bathroom at upper level and a kitchen unit to cooking space. But now what is happening is, mostly after the kind of invention of various construction materials and techniques, and now the population are also increasing, and in order to accommodate certain activities and the whole system of the matrilineal kind of society, where after the son gets married he moves away, and how the house is again used, so this kind of practices are also defining certain add-ons to the house. And here, when we talk about the reproduction of the Thai house, which actually how it is taken further in the present context, the obvious features are the traditional roofs at upper river and the contemporary building at ground level. So basically what they did was, if you see the kind of contemporary building at ground level, now this is now a part of kind of usable space, and then the roofs still remain a kind of traditional roofs, but the material will be different for it. So the elements which they are using, though they are kind of depicting, even the angles are slightly changing in that, and the materials now, the timbers, some parts of it have become a concrete thing, and the easily dismantled and transportable is now gradually becoming a kind of permanent. So this is a kind of change one can see in a Thai's house. But what we are trying to see here is how an architect, when he is studying about a particular traditional dwelling, is looking at the kind of chronological order. And now one of the images of Phram Phum Chai's work is the kind how the societies are framing these traditional elements by their appearance. But the kind of whole structure is much more permanent. As I showed you in the ground floor, it's a completely a built system. And then how this whole, the production of a Thai traditional house to the reproduction of the Thai house, how the way it is performed, and the way the spaces are performed, the way the spaces are celebrated, how they are changing, not only by its space, but by their material and specific content. So here, how buildings can study. One is by the chronological development, which I say, okay, by so-and-so year, by so-and-so period, or by so-and-so age. So these buildings have been transforming. But there is another thing, but which should help, is much more relevant for this particular course, is from the specific point of view, from what point of view we are looking at. Are you looking from an anthropologist point of view? Are you looking from a sociologist point of view? Are you looking from a development point of view? Are you looking from a vernacular architecture point of view? So which point? Because there's always a conflict between the tradition and the modern. There's always a contested space somewhere, a debate which comes. So this is very relevant of how a specific point of view will be taken. I'll give you a few examples from my own work. What you see here is a kind of house. One is, this is in Tamil Nadu, somewhere near Kovalam, in the southern tip of Tamil Nadu. And this particular co-dwelling has been given by the agencies to the fishermen communities. Obviously, a fisherman earlier all the co-dwelling units, they're all uniform and standardized units. Now, in that time, I think I'm talking about 2006 or 2007, and many people thought what kind of houses they have given and why, how can a fisherman can get accommodated in these houses. Now, when I look at it, the government and the NGO also had an option of giving a co-dwelling concept. In the co-dwelling, first they give in a particular few cents of land, you give them a co-dwelling, so under an impression that the family, whenever he gets some financial support or when he becomes better, he obviously modifies his dwelling and within that limited. So now, 8 years after, I visited again the same places. Now these dwellings have again taken a new form. People started building the boundary walls. People started expanding these kind of porches and with a tiled porches, which depict the kind of the traditional way of facade. And they put the coconut trees and the kind of all the landscape. So now the whole landscape is a very different thing. So now if I talk about the context of how people have responded to it, and if I'm looking from a development perspective, and the way the people have responded with their own resources is very different here. So which perspective I'm looking? I'm looking from a development perspective and which point of time I'm looking at. So now imagine the same thing which I looked 7 years before, I myself have thought about it. But now I looked at it, so now it has given a different meaning, different impression. Now, in a contrary of it, we were doing a vernacular architecture studio from School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal, in my previous workplace. We took the architectural students to study the Bhil tribes and the Gond tribes in the Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh area. And here you can see these kind of tribal dwellings. They're all built with ramdeath, which is completely ramdeath material, and they also have these kind of black color paintings, which they represent their belonging within that habitats. Now, the government has started giving, in the name of a development, they started giving, constructing toilets using brick and concrete. Now how communities have perceived this is they are using it as a kind of storage. And many of the communities which we have visited in these villages, they hardly use this space, or they felt that it's a kind of storage, because neither there was some issues with the coordination of fulfillment of providing a toilet, and neither they see some detachment of their material culture with the modern materials. And not only that, another story I will say about this symbol, which is Om. In fact, I thought when I went to these villages, every house is having a Om, and we thought they really respect some kind of Hindu traditions or maybe other religious. But then later, with some interactions with these tribal people, we came to know that their goddess, they don't refer themselves into the kind of Hindu gods, but they themselves pray certain gods like the river gods, Narmada, and some other gods who are actually locally known, but they are not into they don't believe that they follow all the Hindu rituals or any kind of symbolic aspects. But then what happened was some of the organizations, names unknown, that they say they have spread a rumor saying that there was an evil spirits going on in the village, so you need to put this in order to protect this symbol and protect your house. Now every house have this symbol. So now in a span of time, even if someone is putting a new building a new house, he is still putting a symbol without knowing a logical reason behind it. So in that way, in this particular contested contest, now how we can understand this built form? Can we understand that what development, what any agency is thinking, how these people should be like, or can we understand how these people are able to understand the other ideas, or how they are able to absorb the other ideas which are coming externally. So that is where the specific point of view is very much required. Are you looking from the very indigenous point of view? Are you looking from a very shallow point of view, or are you looking from a top-down point of view? So that is what I showed, like how the government have visualized and how people have responded, but how the people started rejecting these things. So in the same way, and now I also relate here. It is not only the form which is giving you the behavior, but it is also the behavior which is also giving the form. So in fact, Rappaport talks about there is a link between behavior and form in two senses. One is, the first sense, understanding of behavior patterns, including desires, motivations, and feelings, is essential to understand of built form, since built form is the physical embodiment of these patterns. Now, in the sense that forms once built affect behavior and way of life. So basically it is a two-way process. One is a form and another is a behavior. So form influencing the behavior and behavior influencing the form. This is the debate which we are talking about. I'll show you a small example of my own work in which I did in the tsunami affected areas of Tarangambadi. I was working in Tarangambadi area. What you can see here is the Tarangambadi. This is a mental map which I have taken from the fishermen. In the fishermen societies, what they are very closely, and they are living next to the sea. You can see that there is a sea here, and I asked them to draw. After the tsunami, I gave a pencil to them and I asked them to draw. Can you draw the a mind map of your settlement, how it has changed? Then the pen started shivering, because for the first time some of them have touched the pencil in their life. So now I did another technique of what I did was, I've taken a printout of before tsunami and after tsunami. So this one was before and this one was after. So now in this layout you can see that this whole thing is a complete settlement of itself, which is where they have a quarters of, there is a quarter of Danish people living here. There's a pre-colonial buildings which are occupied by the Muslim community here, and Danish, and the fisherman. Now I asked him, in the pre-tsunami context, what was where was your dwelling? He just pointed out here. Then I asked him, how do you moved out? How you used to move around? He said, my children go to school in the Princess Street, and then we go to the town center, and this is the ice factory, and this is the temple, Renuka Devi temple. That's all the movement pattern is there. But whereas in the post-tsunami, they have moved to a new location here, somewhere here. Now I asked him how you are moving. Now the moment in this factor, the moment I said here is the Renuka Devi temple as a landmark, he immediately recognized his house, and then he started pulling down the way he is going to the school. I think in both the ways they are moving, but the fundamental difference which I find here was, in one of the interviews I got a Muslim family. They are feeling very bad because they are missing their friends from the other clusters. I didn't realize why they were missing, but here now I came to know this map is telling me the difference, why they are missing their neighbors, because these people are moving completely on the periphery of the town, and they are not using this Princess Street, which is connecting the three clusters of the fisherman, the Muslim, the Danish. So this movement itself is affecting their connections with the neighbors, and that is how it is weakening the neighborhood interaction. So now this is a very good example of a small pedestrian movement, a small eyesight towards looking at how they are walking, how they are meeting them, and now these Muslim communities, they started feeling lonely because no one is around, and they started selling the houses and moving around. And again, we talk about certain spaces in the Iquitos, Peru, which is also referred as a kind of floating villages. Here you can see that floating village. Sometimes the vernacular architecture, they always say about this is a kind of climatically adaptable, and this is was one of the best people have made. It is much more appropriate with the climate. But however, Rappaport brings certain examples of how it may not be necessarily for every time it is for climatic reasons, but it could be of also for some other reasons. It could be of a status reasons, it could be of a social and economic reasons. So he gives a little example of in the native port of Belen, especially in the Iquitos floating houses, they have this kind of identical frame and construction, and there's addition of solid walls being the only major change. So when they started, because being a floating house, obviously it has to be a little lightweight. And now the way they are adding the solid walls, that is actually making them uncomfortable, because it might have been because of the permanency status of the desire of status in that has introduced by the new cultures, and also almost reflects the new attitudes to the requirements of privacy. So obviously the whole house forms, it is not just a climatic need, but it is also something about how the status and the symbolic aspects are influenced the way of life. Now I will a little bit talk about the charms from the Cambodia and Vietnam side on the Southeast Asia. And these are often referred as the skillful artisans, where they have this kind of weaving traditions and the dyeing traditions. So the charms are very well known as an artisans. And Rappaport also brings that certain religious prescriptions, not necessarily every time it talks about climatic, but it also brings anti-climatic solutions. For example, we always in Indian cultures, we say that there should be a tulsi plant, and there's a neem tree which can actually protect from any kind of bacterial infections or any other thing. Similarly, but it is little an anti-climate. They said who regard shade cast by trees as unlucky. You can see that so that the both houses and streets are exposed to the terrible sun and trees never planted. You can see, of course, here you can notice a small banana plantations, but which is a local culture there. But otherwise, if you can see the whole landscape, this all looks very dry in the hot sun. And in Cambodia, a similar lack of shade of trees is brought about by the belief that it is unlucky for roots to find their way under the house. So the moment you're having a big tree under the house, obviously when the roots start growing, obviously it will have its impact on the house building structure. So there's a technical reasons behind it, why they want the trees to be little far away. Now in the dwellings of charm, they have a kind of the courtyard systems where they dry the grains and the fish or any seafood like that. And you can see that all these, some of them are built with a kind of mud walls, and the way they follow certain patterns, and they follow they have certain forces, I mean they have certain implications on how they use the spaces. Now, with all this discussion of the understanding of vernacular architecture, it is not only from a technical point of it, or is it a climatic point of it, or it is a political point of it, it is also the consumption point of it in all the examples which we discussed. And it is also not from just how it is evolving from a chronological point, and it is also from the whose perspective you are looking at. I think this is where Marcel Wellinga, who is now the director of the Vernacular Architecture Center in Oxford Brookes, he talks about the end of vernacular, anthropology, and the architecture of the other. It's a very good summarization of how he brings anthropology and architecture in relation. And in fact, there has been a lot of work has been done in the field of anthropology, and especially he points out to certain literature on Southeast Asian architecture. However, it fails to take into account the mutually constitutive relation between people and things that has been explored at the same time in the fields of material culture studies and consumption and the study of perception of the environment. So this is where he says that there has been a little disconnect between what anthropology experts have done and what architecture have thought about. And now mainly when we talk about vernacular, it actually comes from a very linguistic psychology, and it is a kind of linguistic term, how it is locally used and locally produced and locally domestically produced and domestically consumed, a kind of linguistic paradigm, and how it is reflected in the architecture. So it has been defined through various decades by various different philosophers, and with differences in emphasis, mainly on national and disciplinary backgrounds and affiliations. And they talk basically about to establish a normative distinction between vernacular and the other architectural traditions that is explicitly based on differences in product. So whenever we are talking from the vernacular, we are obviously making a difference between the other architectural traditions, other building products. Okay, and what is this other? Let's see how it is mostly it is often discussed to distinguish it from modern or polite forms of architecture that are seen to be more national or international in nature. So in fact, the moment starting from Amos Rappaport, starting from Bernard Rudolfsky's time, how the vernacular architecture is already almost discussed is, they are saying this is a common man's, this is a peasant's dwelling, but it is making it, the moment you are discussing a particular subject, it is obviously making a distinction of the other subject. Like for instance, when we say, when Steen talks about vernacular as built by hand, so handmade architecture which is handed down from generation to generation. Whereas Rudolfsky, he talks about a non-pedigreed architecture in his book of Architecture Without Architects. But it, and again in Rappaport, he talks about house form and architecture. That is where again, and here Paul Oliver, he brings to discussion of architecture of the people. So all these where it is, they are pointing out to distinguish from more industrialized and formalized or elitist forms of architecture. In fact, why we are discussing about this kind of distinction, or maybe in our subconscious we are talking about a specialized interest of that, at the same time we are ignoring the processes that are making us to distinguish with the other. So that is what this other, the architecture of the other. So how the experts started understanding architecture in order to make distinguishing with the modern and the polite forms of architecture. So now the moment we are talking about how to understand vernacular, and that is where anthropology is one of the important, anthropology of shelter is one of the important tool, how we can integrate. Like for instance, I can show you one of the important component of in my own work, how the dwelling in the tsunami affected area and how it has been modified and how people started responding to it. It involves a greater ethnographic research and greater interaction with the community, and it is not only about the technical part of it, but it is also social and the cultural part of it. Okay, thank you very much.